Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be making a fanny pack, and this is actually a revision of a fanny pack I did in the past. We're going to be using the same pattern with a few minor adjustments and also going into more detail on each step. So if you watched the other video and got a little lost, hopefully this video will bring you up to speed and get you making perfect fanny packs. And this project is on the easier side when it comes to making bags, so if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, grab that printable download and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need a half yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a canvas, denim, or twill. These are all super durable fabrics and very easy to work with. So if you're just getting into sewing, I recommend looking at these fabrics before you jump into something crazy. I'm actually gonna be using an upholstery fabric. This is a little bit harder to work with. Fortunately, this fabric is not loosely woven like a lot of the other fabrics I use, so it should be on the easier side to work with. But like always, since you are making this bag and you want it to stand out amongst all those other fanny packs, get creative with it and use whatever fabric that you wanna use. And you can always make adjustments to make your fabric work. You'll need a half yard for your secondary fabric, and this is gonna be the lining fabric, so I recommend using a lightweight material. I'm just using a standard printed cotton fabric. It's very lightweight, super thin, because once you start stacking these fabrics together, the thinner the lining, the easier it is to sew at the end. So I recommend playing around with the main and secondary fabric. If you have a thicker main fabric, then I recommend a thinner secondary fabric, but if your main fabric is a little bit thin, you can actually double up and use the same material for the main fabric and the secondary fabric. You'll need two zippers, one 12-inch and one 16-inch. And these zippers don't have to be the exact size because we will be snipping the ends. I'm actually gonna be cutting mine off of a zipper roll. This is a really great way to go if you're planning on making a lot of bags because you can cut your zippers to the exact length with minimal waste. You'll need 2 yards of 1-inch webbing. We'll be using this for the strap. If you want to go less than 2 yards, you totally can. This is just a safe place to start and you can trim it down from there. Going along with that webbing, you'll need 1 buckle and 1 strap slider. You want these strap sliders to match the width of your webbing, so you want your buckle and strap slider to be a 1-inch width. But if you do plan stepping up the width of the webbing, you will need to step up the buckle and strap adjuster to match the width of your webbing. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. Before you tape it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting.
And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best possible results. From here, we're going to cut on the outside of the black line. And after cutting out all your panels, you should end up with 2 front top panels, 1 cut out of your secondary fabric and 1 cut out of your main fabric, 2 front side panels, both cut out of your main fabric, 4 flat panels, 2 cut out of your secondary fabric and 2 cut out of your main fabric, 2 top panels, 1 cut out of your secondary fabric and 1 cut out of your main fabric, 2 front panels, 1 cut out of your secondary fabric and 1 cut out of your main fabric, 1 back pocket panel cut out of your secondary fabric, 1 bottom inside panel cut out of your secondary fabric, and lastly 2 back panels, 1 cut out of your secondary fabric and 1 cut out of your main fabric. Moving on to assembly, we're going to start by grabbing both of our front panels. Lay the panels out with right sides facing up, locate the zipper edge on the pattern, and on the panels, grab your 12-inch zipper. And we're going to sew the zipper to that zipper edge. Again, the zipper doesn't have to be exactly 12 inches. All we wanted to do is go past the edges because we're going to end up snipping the ends after we sew it on. So as long as your zipper is longer than the panels, you're good to go. Place the right side of the zipper to the right side of the main fabric, and the right side of the secondary fabric to the wrong side of the zipper, sandwiching the zipper in between both of the panels and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, double check both sides, make sure everything is still lined up, flip the wrong sides together. And what I like to do is place a few pins so those layers don't move around. Check the secondary fabric and the main fabric. If everything is lined up, I'm going to add a top stitch to that top edge. This stitch is very noticeable, so I recommend using an edge presser foot to get a nice straight stitch. With both of our front panels attached to the zipper, we can move it to the side and grab our front top panels. What we're going to do is sew these to the opposite side of the zipper, making sure we line them up with the outside edges of our front panel. So place the right sides together, sandwiching the zipper in between the panels just like we did the front panels. and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Quickly double check to make sure the panels are still lined up at the top of the zipper, and from here we're going to flip the wrong sides together. With the outside edges lined up, place a few pins and add a top stitch. As you can see, we're starting to form the bottom zipper pocket of the fanny pack, but if you noticed, I don't have a zipper train in there, so I'm going to grab my zipper train before we move on to the next step. I typically like to wait till the last minute to add the zipper train because it gets in the way when you're top stitching. And real quick, you can slide the zipper on either side of the zipper. It just really depends on what side you want it to open on. Moving on, grab your back pocket panel, locate the zipper edge at the top of the panel. This edge should match up with the pocket assembly we're currently working on, and we're going to place the right sides of the secondary fabric together. The height of both of these panels should be exactly the same after sewing the assembly together. If yours is looking a little off, that's totally fine because zippers come in all different widths, and using a 1/4 inch seam allowance on a different size zipper can throw it off just a little bit. And there's a few ways you can correct this. You can either resew it to the zipper with the adjusted seam allowance, or you can just snip the top edge to match the back pocket panel. Ultimately, the main goal is to get both of these panels lined up. From here, we're going to grab the front side panels, lay the side panels out with right sides facing up on either side of our pocket assembly. The inside edge of the front side panel should be the same width as the side edge of the assembly. Flip the front side panels directly on top, lining up the outside edges with right sides together. At this point, your assembly should be sandwiched in between your back pocket panel and your front side panels. Stitch both side edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, double check both sides to make sure the layers didn't move around, and from here we can take care of the zipper ends by snipping them flush with the seam allowance. Fold the front side panel so the right side is facing up. If done correctly, the bottom should curve perfectly and the top should be lined up flat. And if for some reason it doesn't line up, you have to go back and see where it went wrong. Either you cut the panel a little bit too high or too short, or you used a different seam allowance for the zipper. But overall, fixing those issues will give you the correct size. Once you have the correct size, we're going to add a top stitch to both of the front side panels. After finishing up the stitch, double check the main fabric and the secondary fabric, make sure everything's lined up. If it's looking good, we can move on to the next step and grab the bottom inside panel. Using the pattern, we're going to locate the zipper edge at the top of the panel and the top of the assembly. Grab your 16-inch zipper, and again, it just has to be wider than both of these panels. We will be snipping it flush with the seam allowance in future steps, so as long as it's wider, you're good to go. Place the right side of the zipper to the right side of the main fabric and the wrong side of the zipper to the right side of the secondary fabric. Line up the side edges, place a few pins, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just like in previous steps, double check to make sure both of those layers are lined up with the top edge of that zipper. Flip the wrong side together, adjust all the layers so they line up at the sides and the bottom. Place a few pins to prevent the layers from moving around and add a top stitch. After finishing up the top stitch, you can start to see that this is the entire bottom assembly for the fanny pack. Before we move on, I like to mark the center at the top and the bottom of the assembly. I only mark it on the main fabric, but feel free to mark it on both sides. Moving on to the next step, we're going to grab both of the top panels. Using the pattern, we're going to do the same thing and mark the center on both sides of the panel. And for this one, we're going to do it for both the main fabric and the secondary fabric. It's crucial to mark the exact center because we're going to be placing the right sides together, lining up the centers. And if they're off a little bit, it's going to throw that entire top panel off. Just like in previous steps, we're sandwiching the zipper in between both of the layers with the right sides together. But with this one, we're actually going to be starting at the center and sewing towards the outside. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because we're working with the curved edge, and sometimes it can stretch a little more depending on what fabric you use, so you get a better center marking when you start at the center and sew towards the outside edges. Pop the right sides out, take a look around, make sure the side edges line up correctly. And the big thing with this panel is it's very hard to get it lined up directly in that center. You may all of a sudden end up with a wider top panel, and this is because you're sewing on that curve. That curve stretches it more because you're going on a slight bias. So adjusting your machine to work with that bias stretch is really crucial to get the right size top panel. And depending on what type of fabric you're using, you may have to play around with the actual size of the top panel to get it to line up correctly to the sides of the bottom assembly. But just like anything, it takes a little time and practice, and from here we're going to make sure that top edge is lined up and add a top stitch. This stitch is very noticeable, so I highly recommend taking your time to make it look nice and neat. After finishing up the top stitch, grab your zipper train, add it to the same side of the zipper. Since I added mine on the right side, I'm going to add it on the right side again so that both of the pockets open from the same direction. With the zipper train on and move towards the center, we can grab our flat panels. Using the pattern, we're going to locate the top edge, and we're going to lay these out just like we did the front side panels on either side of the assembly. The taller side edge should match up perfectly with the side edge of your assembly. And like we went over in previous steps, if it's not lining up correctly, it probably has to do with the width of the zipper. So always try to adjust with the width of your zipper to work with the pattern. But anyways, moving on, place the right sides together, sandwiching the assembly in between both of the flat panels. Place a few pins and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take your time sewing over the zipper so you don't break a needle. After finishing, double check both sides, make sure everything is lined up perfectly. Grab a pair of scissors and snip the zipper ends flush with the seam allowance. Fold the flat panel so the wrong sides are together and the outside edges are lined up. Place a few pins and add a top stitch to both of the flat panels. Top stitching is not mandatory, but in the end it makes for a stronger and a more professional looking bag. This will complete the entire front assembly, so double check along that bottom edge, make sure all the panels are lined up and the curve is looking good. If everything is looking good, we can place this panel off to the side and grab our back panels. The first thing we want to do is separate the main fabric from the secondary fabric so that way we can place the wrong sides together. Line up the outside edges for both of the layers. Using the pattern, locate the webbing placement guide, and this is for 1-inch width webbing. If you're using a wider webbing, you're going to have to adjust the side edges to work with the size webbing you're using. I'm using a pretty basic 1-inch width poly webbing. It's a thinner webbing, but it'll do the job. And what I'm going to do is lay it out so I can cut 2 1-yard strips. This will end up being a 1-yard strip on each side of the fanny pack. You can go smaller, but I recommend starting a little bit larger so that way when you try it on, you can adjust it down. Line up the webbing strips directly in the center of the webbing placement guide. We're going to add a tack stitch as close as we can to the outside edge. This is just going to secure the webbing down so it doesn't move around. When we're attaching the 2 assemblies in future steps, I like to roll the webbing up so it's really nice and clean and out of the way. Grab your complete front assembly, mark the centers on the top and bottom for the front assembly and the back panel. Place the right sides together, lining up the centers on the top and bottom edge. Add a couple pins, and when these layers are lined up, we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take your time sewing around the bottom curved edge. I like to work along with it like we did that top panel on the zipper. After finishing up the stitch, you may want to go back and add a few more tack stitches where the webbing is to really lock that down. Before we move on to the next step, I highly recommend opening it up, checking the right side to make sure it's lined up and all the layers are stitched together. Sometimes you'll come across a gap and you want to fix that before we add the bias tape. And that is the next step, adding the double fold bias tape to that raw edge on the inside. You can skip this step, but it's a really good step if you want to make your bags professional. It's going to clean that raw edge up and ultimately make it stronger. Before we do that, we want to snip the webbing flush with the seam allowance and clean up that outside edge as much as possible. If everything is looking good, I'm going to run you through a few techniques. The first method is using a bias tape making kit. In this technique, you make your own double-sided bias tape to the size and fabric you want to use. All you do is cut your strips, feed it through your folder, and press it when it comes out the folder. It's very easy to do, and you get to customize the bias tape to your exact measurements. The second technique is using a double fold bias tape binder. This is the most efficient technique. You cut your strips, feed it through your binder, and sew it directly to your raw edge. And the last technique is using pre-made double fold bias tape. You are limited to colors, but it's very easy to use. You fold it over the edge and stitch it down. And you want to make sure you apply it all the way around the outside edge. I'm going to be using the double fold bias tape attachment. First I add it to the sides, snip it flush, and then I add it to the top and bottom edge. I like to extend my bias tape past the edges about 1 to 2 inches. This allows me to fold those bias tape strips over once or twice and add a tack stitch. Since this is on the inside of the bag and tucked up in the corners, it doesn't have to look perfect, but it doesn't hurt making it look nice and neat. From here, we can pull the right sides out, finally get a good look at the fanny pack. Hopefully yours is looking nice and symmetrical at this point. Going into the final steps, all we have to do is add that buckle. So line up the strap so the right side of the strap is facing up. Before we add the buckle, you can quickly throw it around your waist and see what size it is to see if you want to trim it back or not. But anyways, grab your buckle and your strap slider. I'm using a 1-inch buckle and strap slider to match my 1-inch webbing. Feel free to work with either side of the strap. The first thing we're going to do is slide the strap slider on about 1 to 1.5 feet. You may have a different looking buckle. I have one with 2 openings and 1 opening. You can have this, or you can have both sides with 1 opening. It really doesn't matter. We're gonna start with a 2 opening side. Loop the webbing around the opening from the back, pull it down about a foot. Feed the webbing through the strap slider from the back opening to the front opening. Pull the webbing end out enough so you can roll the end over once and tack stitch it down. You mainly want to give yourself enough room so you can feed it through your sewing machine without sewing the opposite side of the webbing loop. With the webbing end tack stitched down, you can see this forms the adjustable side of the strap. From here, we're going to move to the opposite strap, feed the webbing end through the buckle from top to bottom, roll the end over once, and add your tack stitch. When it comes to the tack stitch, you can do a box stitch, you can do an X stitch. Pretty much any stitch will work, you just want to make sure you really tack it down. I'd recommend pulling the strap a few times just to make sure it's nice and stitched down. From here, you can try it on, see how it fits. It's super easy to just dethread it, snip it, sew it again, and really get it to your right measurements. Once you're satisfied with the fit, the final step is adding your branding. And I also like to add zipper pulls the same way I add my branding. I'm just using a strip of leather that I've branded and added with a double-sided rivet. But anyways, have some fun with it and try to make something new that's not already out there.
And there you go, your fanny pack is complete. Hopefully this video filled in all the missing information from the last video. I'd like to go into detail on each step so everyone can follow along easily at their own pace. And again, if you're having any issues with putting the panels together, there are a lot of moving parts. If you're not using the correct seam allowance or the fabric has a different stretch to it, it may throw things off and you might have to adjust according to the fabric you're using. But it's not the end of the world. You can cut and snip as you go to make it work. And like always, I want to see what you come up with, so tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing. But until then, I'm going to keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.